we have long had the largest number of college students, overtaken by Indonesia only more than a decade ago, as the next slide shows. But the largest expansion in college enrollment has taken place in Thailand and Indonesia. The next slide. From nearly 131,000 Thai students in 1975 to 1.2 million in 1995, and close to 280,000 Indonesian students in 1975 to 2.3 million 20 years later. To cope with the demand for tertiary enrollment, many countries in the world responded horizontally by creating more universities and taking in greater numbers, and vertically by creating institutions that cater to diverse capacities. Community college, technical nursing institute, comprehensive university, distance learning research university. In developing countries, however, higher education institutions are less diversified than in high-income countries. In our case, junior and community colleges do not exist, perhaps because of the overwhelming cultural value we assign to a 4-year college diploma, even if the diploma comes from an institution hardly more advanced than a high school. On the other hand, and this is the paradox of our century, higher education faces the grave challenge of marginalization at a time when knowledge so rigorously demands it. The university budget is typically the most visible articulation of marginalization efforts for several reasons. The global fight against poverty gives primordial significance to basic education. Higher learning must take a backseat while functional literacy is raised. In the developing world, fundamental needs of healthcare, education, and social security battle it out in the tragedy of the commons. And in countries like ours that are ruled by governments with self-serving priorities and without a vision of the future, except for Fantasy Island, think Enchanted Kingdom, even the beleaguered budget for education becomes an arena of corruption, patronage, and mediocrity. Think textbook scam. However, even in the developed world, or what used to be so, university budgets have remained at insufficient levels. Professor Alison Richard, Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, laments that British universities are, and I quote, hopelessly underfunded, end quote. All over the United States, even prior to the implosion of Wall Street, public universities voiced a similar complaint. One effect of marginalization is the tendency toward market-driven education, or what some might call the corporatization of the academe. Public universities struggle to survive amid reduced budgets, growing competition among tertiary institutions, faculty piracy prompted by indecent salaries, and reputations that increasingly rest upon global rankings of universities. The current drive for the internationalization of universities, which the survey of the Times Higher Education Supplement lays heavy emphasis on, is partly an attempt to pirate the best talents in the world, both faculty and students. Countries like the UK, where tuition at top universities has remained low compared to Harvard and other American universities in their league, are under tremendous pressure to raise fees. Vice Chancellor Richard of Cambridge complains, and I quote, "There is a prevailing view in the UK that students, all students, are a source of income, not an investment in the future," end quote. Across the Atlantic, scholarships based on need are being replaced by merit-based awards, as American universities attempt to raise their ranking by taking in better qualified students who usually do not come from lower income, Black, or Latino families. Access to higher education, then, has become a major global concern, and not just in obvious cases such as ours and other developing countries. Although tertiary enrollment in England rose in 2000 compared to 1994, for example, the Higher Education Funding Council pointed out that the proportion of poorer students, and I quote, hardly changed at all, end quote. Furthermore, college-age students in England's wealthiest neighborhoods have a better than 50% chance of entering university, compared to 10% for students who come from the poorest areas. In the United States, the trend favors white American students, 30% of whom obtained bachelor's degrees in 2006, compared to only 15% of African American students and 10% of Hispanic students. While entrenched divisions between rich and poor in the West might offer solace to those who have been long familiar with inequity, the issue of access in the developed world is approached quite differently from ours in the less developed countries. In the United States, for instance, the issue of access arises from the shift in a manufacturing-driven industrial economy to a third-wave service economy, propelled by information and technological innovation. About 54% of domestic job openings in America in the decade 2004-2014 are expected to be filled by workers with some post-secondary education, unlike the old economy, which did not require college-level knowledge and skills. Today, in anticipation of greater changes to come, a call to develop a college-going culture has been made. Ironically, in the Philippines, such a culture has not been foreign to us. Even a secretary here is required to possess a college degree, unlike in England, where O-level credentials are sufficient. And yet, the fastest growing domestic job openings here do not require higher order competencies, only the ability to speak English with an alien twang. The fact is that in the developing world outside the West, the concern with access emanates from the stark condition of poverty and its twin, social inequity. Our Commission on Higher Education frames its vision and thrust toward poverty reduction, but unfortunately makes no projection about the local job sector or expectations of competencies required in its medium-term plan for 2005-2010, and says little else beyond the bland statement about the need to advance knowledge, quote, for the improvement of academic instruction, productivity enhancement, and job creation, and in addressing the key issues confronting Philippine society, end quote. Marginalization also finds articulation in the quality of learning. Listen to this, and I quote, 73% of all colleges still find it necessary to offer remedial classes for entering students. Sounds like universities in a third world country, right? Wrong. The description speaks of the United States of America. The Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation found that 15-year-old American students placed 35th in math and 36th in science among 57 countries that took part in the 2006 Student Assessment Program. Moreover, even the highest achievers among the American students performed below their international peers. There is, too, concern in the United States that it will soon pale in the shadow of Asian universities, particularly Chinese, in the field of science and technology. For instance, the Task Force on Future of American Innovation singles out, as a contrast to the US, China's recent declaration that it would transform 100 of its universities into the world's best research universities, a matter of Chinese national priority. China expects to do this by tapping Chinese experts trained abroad and Chinese American experts. I have little doubt that China will command its resources and meet these objectives. Now, what about us? We all agree that the education pipeline is poorly constructed to begin with. And being at the other end of the pipeline, there is little we can do to clean out the rot, remove the rust, or deepen the pipeline. But even in UP, higher education has become increasingly remedial, not just at the level of incoming freshmen who experienced the XDS program in the 70s and 80s and summer bridge programs in the 90s, but also juniors and seniors who do not possess or are not adequately being prepared for 21st century competencies. Yet, they enter the world with our diploma. Each year, I worry that we will graduate students with bachelor's degrees who do not know how to write or do not understand what they read in a critical way, or perhaps read very little, or are unable to analyze what they learn before recycling it in an essay exam or a term paper. The inabilities of incoming students we can blame on basic education, the clog in the pipeline. But the responsibility for the failed abilities of upper undergraduate students rests at least partly on our shoulders. My sense is that we are not prepared to deal with the corrective needs that plague higher education. First, our attitude is that we are here to advance knowledge, not to cure it. When students enter UP, we assume they possess the prerequisites. And if they do not, that's their problem, not ours. Second, if we were to spend our energy and resources on remedial education, less would be left for real education, which is our primary, and many would argue, our sole task. And third, by doing remedial courses, we diminish our standards and thereby shortchange our students. All these are valid arguments, but what is not acceptable is when we ourselves lower standards to ensure that our courses will always have students, or because teaching is too painstaking and eats far too much of our time. For instance, a number of colleagues have suggested to me that the reason for the surprisingly large number of honor graduates